For 3 years, Canadians have been worried and angry about how hard it is to pay for the necessities of life: housing, energy, food, and that anger is justified. But there's some forces out there who want to take advantage of that anger and divert it into blaming scapegoats for the problem instead of the true culprits. They blame immigration, they blame government, they blame taxes, they blame unions for demanding wages that are too high. Those are false arguments. We need to get to the bottom of the problem, see the true evidence about what's caused the crisis in living standards, and how to solve it. This picture explains why Canadians have been so worried about buying the necessities of life over the last 3 years. Inflation usually runs at about 2% a year. That's the Bank of Canada's target for inflation. But after the COVID lockdowns ended, inflation took off up to 8% by mid-2022. Then it came down as quickly as it rose, and we're back to the 2% target today. Yet the cost of housing and food and other essentials still seems high, and Canadians struggle to pay for them. There are various theories about what caused that spike in inflation after the pandemic. The Bank of Canada blames excess demand. In other words, Canadians had too much money to spend. They also blame a wage price spiral, the idea that wages were growing too quickly, partly because inflation was too low by their standards at 5%, and therefore higher wages led to higher prices. Others, like Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, blame other factors. He blames Justin Trudeau personally for the problem, even though inflation happened all around the world. Trudeau is to blame because deficits were too high, or taxes were too high, or most of all, because of the carbon pricing system. Axe the tax, and everything will be better. Let's look at some of the facts behind these theories. First of all, there's been no connection between inflation and wage growth since the pandemic. Unit labor costs, that's the red line, measure how much employers pay in wages, salaries, pensions, and benefits per each unit of real output in the economy. It's been trucking along, growing gradually, as it should, over this period. Inflation took off without any change in that wage path, and it came back down. No wage price spiral here. Same goes for the general theory about purchasing power. Canadians could get money to spend from other sources, such as the CERB benefits and other emergency programs put in place during the pandemic. The blue line shows household after-tax disposable income as a share of overall output. And there was a spike in purchasing power during the lockdowns, thanks to the CERB benefits and other emergency programs, but they were unwound very quickly. And long before inflation took off, purchasing power was stagnating. It's grown recently, over the last couple of years, gradually, even as inflation came down. So you can't blame Canadians for having too much money to spend. That's blaming the victims for inflation that was caused by other factors. How about Mr. Poilievre's theory about the deficit? Well, the deficit did grow a lot during the pandemic lockdowns because of CERB and the other benefits and other programs. That's a good thing. That saved us from an all-out depression. But that spending was unwound as soon as the economy reopened. And before inflation took off in late 21 and early 22, the budgets for Canada's federal government and the provinces were almost balanced. So there's no connection between the deficit and inflation. Same goes for government taxes. Tax revenues as a share of GDP or relative to overall real output fell during the pandemic. Why? Because industries were shut down, people weren't working and paying income taxes, they weren't shopping and paying GST. So revenues fell. They clawed back to normal when the economy reopened and have been growing at a normal pace since then. No connection between inflation and taxes. On the carbon tax, Mr. Poilievre's favorite evil villain, it's exactly the opposite story. Carbon pricing came in Canada in 2019, and that's when inflation was low. It fell further, inflation fell in 2020. Then in 21 and 22, when oil prices were taking off and gasoline prices soared, that's when the carbon price became smaller as a share of the total cost of gasoline or other energy products. Now, with inflation back down, the carbon price is adding about 3 cents per liter of gasoline year after year, but that's shrinking as a share of overall price levels. So the carbon tax, we don't even know whether it will continue or not. They're certainly not the culprit. This is why Mr. Polyev and the oil industry like to blame the carbon tax for everything. Here's the amount that carbon pricing added to a liter of gasoline in 2022, the worst year of inflation, 2 cents a liter. Meanwhile, the higher prices charged by the oil and gas companies added over 35 cents a liter, 15 times as much. So no wonder they want us to argue about the carbon tax. They're trying to divert our attention from the role of oil and gas companies in higher energy costs. Neither Mr. Macklem nor Mr. Polyev are acknowledging the elephant in the room, the true culprit here. Prices don't rise automatically by magic market forces. Human beings, namely the human beings in charge of companies, make deliberate decisions to raise prices. That's how prices increase, and there's nothing natural about it. Even during an emergency, it's not inevitable that prices for essentials have to grow just because people are desperate and things are in short supply. This is how we've given corporations, particularly in some industries where they've got power, the right to exploit us and charge as much as the market will bear, even during an emergency. So as Canadians were suffering in 21 and 22 from an economic emergency and a health emergency, corporations literally never had it better. Corporate profits in 2022 rose to their highest share of GDP ever in Canada's history, and the stock market hit new record highs. The link between corporate profits and inflation is very clear. The scapegoats that were identified, like wages, excess purchasing power, or taxes, no connection, but a very close connection between corporate profits and the rate of inflation. This shows what I call the unit profit cost, how much corporate profit is baked into each unit of output in our real economy. Statistics Canada doesn't report this. They do report unit labor cost because they're always ready to blame workers for any problems. They should report corporate profit cost. So I've calculated it, and lo and behold, it matches inflation almost perfectly. On the way up, rising profits per unit correlate totally with the rise in the inflation rate. On the way down, profits have moderated since 2022 as the economy stabilized and supply chains were restored, and lo and behold, inflation came down as well. What happened in that 2 or 3 year period to allow companies to jack up prices so much? Well, obviously, you had unprecedented distortions in the world economy. Supply chains were broken. Transportation couldn't happen. Factories producing key commodities were shut down. We had shortages of semiconductors, of new cars, of building products. You also had sudden shifts in consumer demand. First, we couldn't shop at all. Then we could go online and buy goods, but we couldn't buy services as much because travel and restaurants and so on were still closed. So those shocks in consumer demand gave these companies some power. And then finally, a world oil price shock after the invasion of Ukraine that was transmitted directly to Canadians, even though there was no change in the supply of oil for us. Where companies have a pinch point, a strategic position in our economy, they can leverage those disruptions into higher prices and higher profits. And that's exactly what happened. And the pain was worst in the essentials that people have to buy, no matter how much they cost. So profits rose by over 50% between 2019, the last year before the pandemic, and 2022, the worst year of our inflation. So companies never had done as well as they did while Canadians were struggling to put food on the table and a roof over their heads and buy the energy they needed to get around and stay warm. Now, profits have moderated since then, but they're still historically high. And so companies, again, have profited from the disruptions of the last few years, yet are still trying to blame scapegoats for the problem instead of looking in the mirror. I have compiled data on which industries made the most excess profits during that worst period of the cost of living crisis. This shows 20 super profitable industries in Canada and how their profits grew between 2019, before the pandemic, and 2022, the worst year of inflation and high prices. And lo and behold, these are the industries that experienced the highest profit growth because they had the most strategic power during that moment of uncertainty and chaos in our economy. To make this list, an industry either had to increase its profits by $5 billion a year or more, or increase its profits by 100% or more. Okay, so if you doubled your profits or you increased your profits by at least $5 billion, you're on this list. So let's look at who's on this list and see the connection between profits and this challenge in living standards for Canadians. Top of the list is the oil and gas sector. $44 billion in extra profits for the upstream industry, $7.5 billion in extra profits for the downstream industry. Upstream, profits grew by almost 1,000%. So no wonder the oil and gas industry wants us to talk about the carbon tax. They want us to ignore their role in driving up energy prices. Next on the list, housing. So the real estate profits went sky high. Construction profits went sky high. And then the different industries that feed the construction sector with inputs, including forestry, wood products, and building products, also took advantage of the shortages and the surge in demand for home renovations and new home construction to jack up their prices. Third, the banking sector, very closely tied to housing. You can't buy a new house without a mortgage. So as the housing bubble was expanding, the banks were making more money than ever on mortgage loans to Canadians. And other specialty providers like investment banks, securities exchanges, also jacking up profits from those record high stock market prices. The insurance industry, anyone who has to buy insurance for their home knows full well how prices have increased. Finally, what about putting food on the table? There's been a lot of public anger directed at the supermarkets, and rightly so. Their profits more than doubled through the chaos of the pandemic, and they have stayed high, unlike some other sectors. And in corporate agriculture, not family farms, profits, particularly for big players like big meat processors or food manufacturers, have also soared. So you have a situation where companies took advantage of necessity to jack up prices at a moment of unprecedented fear and chaos. And we felt that as consumers and workers more intensely than anywhere else on the necessities of life, energy, housing, and food. Now, those prices are still high, and working people spend more of their income on the essentials of life than high-income people do because they can buy more luxuries, and the prices of luxuries haven't increased as much as the prices of necessities. So the anger that workers feel is legitimate. And corporations, because we have to buy those things no matter how much they cost, took advantage of the pandemic to reap record profits. So the new excess profits captured in 2022, over $50 billion for the oil and gas sector, $60 billion plus for the housing, real estate, construction, and associated industries, close to $50 billion extra in the banking sector, $2.5 billion in the supermarket food retail end. Now, it might seem that $2.5 billion isn't a lot, but their profits more than doubled, and the profit margin on total sales from supermarkets also more than doubled. So they were not just passing on higher costs, they were exploiting the desperation of consumers who had to put food on the table. Now, Canadians have been fighting back against the impact of those higher prices on our standard of living, and by many measures, we've been winning. In this regard, the storyline that Canada is broken, that some of the right-wing populists have been promoting, is quite wrong. Workers have been able in Canada to fight back and defend their living standards. We've seen a big surge in union organizing, collective bargaining, and work stoppages. That has been supported by some of the good features of our labor laws, including new changes like higher real minimum wages in most provinces. Minimum wages have grown faster than inflation, and changes like the anti-scab law federally. So again, when Mr. Poilievre dresses up like a worker and shows up at a photo op and says, I'm on the workers' side, be very, very wary, because he wants to take away those institutional supports. He wants to take away the labor laws and the union protections, even using the notwithstanding clause, if need be, to overrule our rights to free assembly. He's not really on the side of workers here. Now we've seen the catch-up of wages. This shows the growth of wages, average hourly wages on a year-over-year basis. And for 2 years now, wages have been growing faster than prices. It took us a while to catch up, but thanks to our unions and our minimum wage laws and our solidarity, we did. And right now, even, wages are growing about 4% a year, twice as fast as inflation. That is allowing real wages to repair the damage done immediately after the pandemic. And average and median real wages in Canada are now higher than they were before the pandemic. Canadians should be proud of that. We repaired our wages faster than most other countries. So we have the right to be angry, for sure, and fearful about our living standards and how to protect them, and the pain and dislocation that was experienced during the pandemic. But we have to direct that anger towards the genuine culprits and lay the groundwork for genuine solutions, rather than scapegoating immigrants and taxes and unions. It's corporations who used the disruptions of the pandemic to reap record profits. Their profits have moderated since 2022, but they're still historically high. And that was the fundamental factor driving the challenge in living standards in Canada. How do we protect our living standards? Number one, we've got to keep wages growing and keep them growing fast. That means protecting our unions and our power to bargain. Number two, we should get back towards lower unemployment. Mr. Macklem's claim that 5% unemployment is too low is absolutely wrong. We should get unemployment below that so that everyone who wants to work can find a job easily. Number three, public programs and the social wage are important to our standard of living. So we need to protect education and healthcare and the other services that are provided by the public sector, not take an axe to them as Mr. Poilievre wants to. Number four, housing is a particular crisis, mostly because it's been commodified. It has become a speculative financial asset rather than a human right. And so we need to increase the supply of housing, especially through non-market or non-profit channels, such as housing co-ops, community trusts, and public housing. Finally, we have to regulate corporate power. So the next time there's a disruption in our economy, and there will be more, companies are not able to take advantage of that moment to fatten their own bottom lines. With price controls, restrictions on monopolization, even public ownership in some sectors makes sense, like housing and energy. We can address the challenges in our living standards. We're doing it at the bargaining table, and we can do it with broader policies that emphasize investment and inclusion rather than scapegoating and austerity. Thank you very much for watching. Please check out our website, centerforfuturework.ca, for more information and to sign up for our newsletter.